Okay, welcome to the Friday Transportation Seminar. My name is Qing Lu, and then I'm associate professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. So I will moderate this seminar today. So today we are very glad to have Dr. Patricia Tice from the University of Central Florida, to give us a talk on the roadway design with considerations of the driver psychology. And Dr. Tice is researcher and engineer and innovator planner and at the University of Central Florida, the Safe and Smart Systems Lab. And she has 27 years experience
causing all kinds of trouble.
In different disciplines in transportation engineering and from the impact analysis and policy and driver psychology, driver behavior. And she has plenty of experience in both industry and academia. And she never fails to discover these kind of moments that brings wow to the audience, and that can bring new new connections between designs and new fields of knowledges. So with that, let's welcome Dr. Tice for her presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Yay, we have a small crowd here, but I'm glad we have a great big crowd online. Today, we're going to be talking about self-explaining roadways. So this was a long path to get here, and I want to give you a little bit of background. I started this as just an engineer. You know, I've been practicing for 27 years. I've lived here in Florida for 7 generations. So I am one of those real natives, and I have been living the suburban dream with my single family house and my sweet little downtown and my SUV. But that suburban dream has caused me a little bit of cognitive dissonance, just a smidge. Suburban environments have problems. I mean, we all can see. Uh-oh. Let's get that back. Let's go to Teams. Thank you for catching that. Sure. Screen. All righty, we'll try this again. All right. 5, please. So, I love my suburban dream, but it does have some problems. And traffic is, of course, one of them. And so I began to ask, is there another way? And part of that comes from my own personal motivation. This is my 20-year-old beautiful daughter who may never be able to drive. So if we're living in a suburban environment and the only way to get around is to drive, what am I going to do with her? I have a life of my own. I don't want to be playing chauffeur forever. Surely all of this years of training would have the answers to fix this, right? Not exactly. As I went along, I'd find some puzzlers. So why does this work? And it does, it works really well, but this doesn't. The geometry is about the same. The volumes are really not that dissimilar, but this doesn't work for anybody down here. And that works everywhere. Why this? This is a gorgeous corridor. You would think you wouldn't be going nearly that fast, but that's how fast everybody's going, not just me. And oh, and by the way, why, if that's the case, let's drop this so you can see my bottom corner. Why is a clear zone not a problem? This is the serious and fatal accidents over the last 5 years. There aren't that many. This is almost a half a mile long segment, and there's nothing really there. So if clear zone is so important, why is clear zone not a problem in this corridor? Then I got hired to do this traffic calming study in this neighborhood. And we got done with it, and we realized that the average speed was 20 miles an hour and the 85th percentile speed was 25. And I'm wondering, how in the world can I do that everywhere? Because, you know, that doesn't happen. And they're still complaining. By the way, if you're doing traffic calming studies, don't look at 85th percentile speed. You want to look at 95th because there's usually 1 or 2 people who are going way too fast, and that's why they're complaining. So we all know there's a pedestrian fatality problem. And this is an easy target. Distraction is a problem, right? And we know that in 2007, Apple put out the first iPhone. And so these smartphones in our hands are a huge distraction. And you can see as market penetration increases, our fatalities have gone up with it. But I don't know about you, that fits a little better. These are the number of complete streets policies around the country. So as we've had more complete streets policies, our fatality rates are going through the roof. And a lot of it is because of this. I mean, we're not very experienced at designing these environments. So if you design an environment that looks like this and call it a complete street, which by the way, FDOT would not, is this a trap? You know, we've invited people to walk or bike in that environment. Is that really safe? I don't think so personally, but obviously 3 people do. So what is this about? We know that urban environments get different behaviors. So why? And can we design for that all the time? Or do we even want to? There's 3 ways to approach this problem. You can approach this within the roadway and think about what's actually happening in the street. You could look at the context around that road, and that's really important. Or you can begin thinking about what's going on in their heads. Because if you can get that last one, you can figure out what to do in the first 2. So we started this research project 4 years ago with a very audacious goal. And the first goal we started out with is, what can we design for a target speed? Is there a way to actually design an environment that we naturally get a target speed? But the more we thought about it, the speed alone really wasn't what we wanted. We want their attention. We want their engagement. If we can't get a target attitude, why do we care about the speed? But then at the end, if you don't know why they have that attitude, you can't replicate it. So making sure that we can actually get to what the attitude causes is really critical. And so the goal is to go from this to this, right? So we want people to go from out of their minds and spaced out to really focused and intentional. And the question is, you know, if we're going to do a research project, how do we test that? We could do that in a simulator, maybe not. We're going on a fishing expedition and we need real fish. So, you know, fishing in a bucket is probably not going to do us any good. So we needed everyday behavior on real streets, and we needed a wide range of environments and a lot of irregularity. We needed places that were just weird. And you can't do that in a simulator. When you design the simulator, you can't just throw in random little things. You don't have time to do that when you're creating the simulation. And we never really knew what would matter. Because we didn't know what was going to matter, we needed the natural environment to actually show us what was going to matter. So the school of fish we were dealing with is driver behavior, and we wanted that in the real world. So we started with the Sharp 2 naturalistic driving study. I swear this was the best use of federal funds we have ever spent. They took about 3,400 cars and they instrumented them up with about 100 instruments per vehicle, and they just let people drive in them for a year. So their own personal car, they paid them $500. And one of the areas happened to be here in Tampa. So we selected out of the 6 areas from the Sharp NDS data, we selected Tampa and Seattle. They ended up with 4 petabytes of data, most of it video. And so we had identified 200 anchor points, 100 in each city. And they were evenly split between Tampa and Seattle. We took each major neighborhood and we picked an arterial, a local road, and a collector at a mid-block, and it had to be multimodal. So you had to have either transit or pedestrian, something that was more than just the car. 1 point in each direction. So if it's a one-way road, we picked the other pair as well to make sure that we were dealing with both directions. The places we selected from had to have at least 30 drives on that segment. And we picked the 10 drives that were the closest to the 85th percentile speed because we wanted them to be moving as free flow as we possibly could get. We wanted to see how they would behave if there wasn't anything to change their behavior, right? So there were two attention variables to start out with. One of them was time on task. So they would measure a 1 second epoch in the middle of that block, and 10 times a second, they would tell me, are they paying attention to driving or are they not, right? Essentially, eyes on the road. Are they seeing forward? Are they seeing their mirrors? How's that going to work? And then multitasking. So are they actually multitasking? And if they're multitasking, what are they doing? Okay. Now, on a whim, we also asked for this. Are there any vulnerable users in the environment when they're driving through? Now, I didn't know how important that was going to get. But that ended up unlocking a lot of different things. For the environment, we measured anything and everything we possibly could. If we could measure it, we did. We even made up measures. When we started seeing some of the patterns in the data, we're like, ooh, how about we measure this? So 6 different corridor widths. Every one of those is very different and has a different impact on behavior, but we didn't know which one was going to matter. So we started out with a mixed ordered probit fractional split model, which is an econometric model that deals with a range of responses and gives you kind of an idea of how critical each of these variables are to that. One of the wild things about multivariate models is that it's kind of like icing a cake. When you start icing the cake, you think about what the cake is, okay? So you go through it, you do your first model, and you figure out what the very most important variable is. And that's the base. So if you're starting with a yellow cake, you're not going to put cream cheese icing on a yellow cake, right? You're going to put chocolate icing on a yellow cake. But if you're starting with a carrot cake, you're not going to put chocolate icing on a carrot cake unless you're Brazilian, and I love that. But you usually use like a cream cheese icing. So the variable that you start with determines what the other variables are going to be. And in this case, it got really interesting. So vulnerable user presence was the most significant, but the shock was it was in the wrong direction. The more vulnerable users there were, the less people paid attention, or at least that's what we were puzzled by that at first. I know why. Turns out when they were measuring time on task, it was literally eyes on the road. And so if you have a vulnerable user in the environment, you're actually going to look at them. Duh. So time on task is going to go down, not because you're not paying attention, but because you are. Okay. So that makes that variable really interesting. Pavement width and eye height, the width at eye height. So the visual width of the corridor were the 2 variables that were the most critical. This was my yellow cake and my carrot cake. And they behaved completely differently. So if I put one of them in the model, and I couldn't put them both at the same time, I would get one set of variables. And I put the other one in the model, I got a whole different set of variables that mattered. And at first that was really confusing. The interaction between the number of lanes and pavement width was one of the first things that floated to the surface. So you have the pavement width, the wider things go, the less attention they were paying. But the more lanes you had, the more attention they were paying. They balance up to about 4 lanes. Once you get past 4 lanes, they're not paying attention anymore. They have the freedom to actually relax, and they're going to be multitasking out the wazoo. Level service complexity increased time on task. That's not really a surprise. On-street parking dropped eyes on the road. Remember, we thought we were measuring attention. Turns out we were just measuring focus. So on-street parking, people would look at the on-street parking to make sure there was nobody coming out, and they would code that as not paying attention. Close driveway spacing increased time on task, and linear street trees. If the street trees were aligned so that they look like a wall, that made a difference. Okay, well, that's an interesting thing. Now, one of the interesting things is when we went through the multitasking, there was a very interesting variable that they handed us, and it was called external distraction. They defined it this way. The driver is looking outside of the vehicle in the direction of a non-driving object, but that could be a pedestrian or an animal or other vehicle, right? Now, to me, that's not a distraction. That's situational awareness, okay? So that external distraction is kind of on the border between really focused in on just the driving environment and really focused in on all of the environment and paying attention to all of the different threats that could be coming at you. And so we coded that a little differently. So in terms of multitasking, if they were completely on task through the entire drive, we coded that as 0. And that's, and we got the list for the 1 second epoch. If it was external distraction only, we coded that as a 1 because we still think that they're paying attention, but we're not positive and we can't be sure. And then of course, if there's 2 simultaneous tasks in addition, you got a 2. And then if there's 3 simultaneous tasks, we give a 3, right? So another probit model, another econometric model. This one, actually, we had the 4 different buckets to deal with, which makes translating it a lot harder. Again, the pavement with number lane trade-off is still there. It's same trade-off. Wide sidewalks decreased multitasking. That's not really a surprise. If you've got a big sidewalk, you probably have some people there. The doorway density becomes really critical. And doorway density, the higher your doorway density was, the less multitasking you had going on. And then longer sight lines. So if you had a very long distance you could see in front of you, multitasking began to go through the roof. You don't have as many conflicts to deal with. And that's lovely. Now we know there's some features that make a difference in attention, but we still haven't gotten to the why, right? And the whole key of the project is not just what matters, but why does it matter? It turns out the dominant variable erases some of the impact of the secondary variables. So if I put something like eyes on the width at eye height for the corridor, that's the dominant variable in my model. A lot of the impacts that you saw that I showed you that were done off of the curb face width, those variables disappeared. And that was really puzzling. So we decided to check each variable independently, one at a time. It's a little labor intensive, but that's not bad. And so repeated measures ANOVA does a good job of that, and it's fast. So we started with this huge long list. And as you can see, you start out and it just looks like a huge mess, right? We have this huge pile of stuff up here. Most of them are very visual, things like the corridor width, and they all have impacts. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that vulnerable user presence, we actually tested that with a repeated measures ANOVA too. So what about the driving environment would actually get people to be there? So if I have short blocks, is it more likely that I'm going to have people walking in that environment? Turns out absolutely it is. But those kinds of comparisons from variable to variable show me what is really important across the board, right? So we compare all 3 of them together. Those visual things seem to matter quite a bit. These are other visual things that are along the length of the roadway. So we had one that had to deal with the width. We've got a whole nother set that have to deal with the length. But there were some really puzzling patterns. We had all of these things over here that seemed to matter in terms of getting a vulnerable user in the space, but had absolutely no impact on attention. And that was really puzzling. So and we weren't quite sure what was going on at that point. We knew that there was something going on with the people being there. That was making a big difference in driver behavior, but why? And what was the impact? There were a lot of visual features that mattered, but a lot that didn't. Walk score you can't see at all. Walk score is a land use measure. So if you've got high complementary land uses, you get a really high walk score. You can't see that though. You don't see that in the roadway. There's a tiny little bit that goes into the walk score for the walking environment, but it's like an add-on at the very end. It's not a very big part of it. So I was talking about this with my buddy, who happens to be a psychiatrist, and he dropped this bomb on me, and I kind of blew my mind. Turns out, he says, well, most driving is in a hypnotic state. Like, okay, well, we dismissed highway hypnosis about 60 years ago because that was all fatigue. So how about you clarify that? What is a hypnotic state? It turns out hypnosis is an increased awareness to what you're cued to, but without metacognition. So when the therapist, the hypnotherapist, gives you a target to focus on, that target is what you focus on, but you don't watch yourself focus on it. That's why hypnotism is so powerful, because you can eliminate a lot of the emotional extra responses to the things that you're remembering because you're not watching yourself remember them, right? But he's right. That's what we do when we're driving. We drive, we don't watch ourselves drive. And when I looked into consciousness research, turns out there's two different levels of consciousness. We think about the higher order thinking consciousness, where we're thinking about our thinking. It usually involves words or pictures that we're actually monitoring ourselves. And it's all in the prefrontal cortex. And you remember all of that. So if you're thinking something, you remember you thinking about it, right? But then there's this other level called phenomenological consciousness. And it deals with the things that you're monitoring in the background. And what's interesting about that is that you are actually conscious of them, just not very conscious of them. So for instance, in this particular study where this picture came from, there's a sidewalk and they threw the sign on the sidewalk. Okay. And the test in the study was, do people see the sign? Right? And without failure, nobody ran into the sign, not a one. Okay. But when you asked them at the end of the street whether or not they saw the sign, only half of them remembered seeing it, and only about a quarter of them remembered what it said. So their actions showed they saw it, they responded to it, but they were not able to remember that they responded to it. They did this similar study in driving in New Zealand. Dr. Charlton did this one, and he did a drive along. Okay, so he's driving along with these people just in a normal environment. They would make a decision and do something in the traffic flow. And if they asked them what decision they just made and why, within 35 to 45 seconds, every single time the person could tell you exactly what they did and exactly why they did it. If you wait to 90 seconds, it's gone. It wasn't there. Or to them, it wasn't there. They don't remember doing it. Now, were they conscious of it? Absolutely, because you could ask them immediately and they would be able to tell you, but they don't remember it. And that's this kind of thing. Once we learn to drive, we quit watching ourselves. And so we have this kind of thing where you're driving along, you realize you're not paying attention. You look around and figure out, reestablish your situational awareness, and then cuss yourself out because you were not driving, right? Only you were. You just don't realize that you were. Now, you can get really spaced out and then you're not paying attention. But for the most part, when you're driving, even when you're driving without awareness, you are far more aware than you think you are. Seeing a face changes all of that. Okay? There's a huge difference in your consciousness when you start seeing faces. We're reflexively drawn to faces. If you flash this picture in front of people, 2/3 of the time, their very first fixation will be on the person's face. You see faces first, you see them most often, and you come right back to them because it's the most beautiful thing you will ever see in your life. Facial recognition is literally tied into the dopamine and oxytocin pathways. You are biophysiologically rewarded for seeing faces. And if they're smiling at you or there's someone you know or like, you don't just get a dopamine hit, you get an oxytocin hit. Okay? So he just smiled at me and that just made me feel fantastic. You see faces even when they're not there. So you get so rewarded for seeing faces, you will find them in places that they aren't. And we see faces before we're even conscious of seeing faces. So the N170 wave happens at 170 milliseconds. It's in the face fusiform gyrus, which is about here on your head. And we'll see that in a brain scan when you flash a picture of a face in front of a person at 170 milliseconds. You don't have conscious thought until 300 milliseconds. So you're actually processing faces before you're even conscious of them because you get a dopamine hit. Now, if it's your own face, it doesn't even take 170 milliseconds. It takes 20. And you get a dopamine hit for that. The reason we know that is because Alzheimer's, one of the primary problems with Alzheimer's is that your dopamine pathways begin to degrade and you no longer have as much dopamine in your brain as you used to. And one of the most devastating symptoms of Alzheimer's is that at first they don't recognize their family and other, the faces in their family, right? As it progresses, they don't recognize that a face is a face because they don't have enough dopamine to cue themselves that this is a face. And that is an absolutely devastating kind of thing. But because of that, we know that dopamine is absolutely instrumental in decoding facial expressions. Turns out the mirror neuron system is also tied into those dopamine pathways. So if I stand here and I wave my hand at you, there's a part of your brain that just picked up its own hand and waved back at me. And the reason that happens is because that's how you decode what I just did. You imagine yourself doing that. You're not even conscious of imagining it, but you imagine yourself doing it and you understand what it would be like if you had done that, what I was communicating. And so you can impute my motivations based on your neurological activity, okay? It's the way that babies learn facial expressions and emotions and empathy. It's very important. So when we take all of that into account, all of these ANOVAs tend to make a little more sense. Now, I've reorganized these based on multitasking. I was hinting before that multitasking seems like it's a little better than that time on task. We were only dealing with 1 second. If I were to redo this, I would have a much longer time frame to deal with. But with 1 second, sometimes you see things and sometimes you don't. You may have seen it before, you may see it later. It's a very short period of time. But the multitasking seems to be pretty consistent. So corridor width is one of the biggest things that matters. And it matters all the time for all three of them: multitasking, time on task, and vulnerable user presence. So if you've got a wide corridor, your people disappear and you're not paying attention to them anymore, right? Narrow corridor, the opposite is true. Lane width doesn't impact driver behavior, but lane width is cumulative. So if you've got a narrow lane and you've got 5 of them, you've got a narrow corridor. If you've got a wide lane and you've got 7 of them, you've got a very wide corridor. So on its own, lane width doesn't matter, but it adds up. Sidewalk width means you've got people close up, and that sense of enclosure or the distance to your first barrier in front of you really makes a big difference. Doorway density matters a lot. It was one of the most critical things, and this is one of the ones that we invented. Nobody had ever thought about that particular measure. And essentially, it's the number of doorways along the block face for every 100 feet. So just to make it a nice round number, we divided it by, if I've got 10 doorways on the corridor and it's 1,000 feet long, I've got 1 doorway for every 100 feet, right? Short blocks and lots of driveways also mean seeing people, but there's another effect that's going on with short blocks and driveways. This one was wild. Just because you increase the density doesn't necessarily mean you increase the attention. And we're calling this the downtown Tampa effect because back in 2011, it's not this way now. Thank you, Danny. But in 2011, when the study was done, you would go to downtown Tampa to work and you would park in a parking garage underneath the building. You would take the elevator up to your office, work all day, come back down, hop right back in your car and go home. There was never anyone on the street. So even though you've got this really super high density, you have no physical activity on the corridor, and people drove like a bat out of hell. I mean, they were driving as if it were a suburban environment, which is not what we're looking for. I had urban designers tell me for years that a downtown is not necessarily an urban environment. And that's why. Because if you don't have any people there, there's no interaction. If you've got blank walls throughout your downtown instead of storefronts, that's not urban. It's just dense suburban, which is a different matter entirely. So the surprise takeaway was that it was never about what we built. It was all about the people in the environment. And that was completely surprising to me. I did not expect that. So we created what we call the conditioned anticipation of people model. So seeing a person means you get a dopamine hit, right? Seeing a person in a dense environment, you're getting the dopamine hit. So you begin to connect the dense environment with the dopamine hit, right? So eventually, Pavlov kind of reaction, you see the dense environment, you expect to see people even if they're not there, and you get the dopamine hit in advance. So you're raising your level of attention, looking for that dopamine hit even before you get in there. Now, what happens when you have a whole pile of people? I honestly don't know yet, but would really like to find out. Because CAP is boosting attention through a neurological mechanism itself, any environment that doesn't take advantage of this is handicapped from the get-go. People who are walking and biking won't go there because they're going to be uncomfortable. And drivers aren't going to expect to see people there. And it becomes this negative feedback loop. They don't come, and the drivers don't expect them, and so the drivers drive crazy, and so the people really don't want to come, and things cycle down from there. And that makes those transitions between urban and suburban space really dangerous, both in time and space. So if you've changed the character of the neighborhood in time, you might have pedestrians in the neighborhood now, but your drivers aren't used to it, and they'll get hit. If you're moving from a suburban environment physically into an urban environment, those fringe edges are always where we have the most crashes. Why? You have a mismatch of expectations. Now, I'm going to bounce over this real quick. This is a far more difficult topic to discuss, but it turns out that the more interruptions you have, the easier it is to maintain driver attention. You can keep their attention better if you're giving them lots of interruptions. So driveways, short blocks, things like that, those will re-engage their attention, because every time you come up on one of these discontinuities, you have to pay attention, right? And the more frequently you have them, the more you're going to be paying attention. So why does corridor width matter? We saw over and over and over again that floats to the top. It's a really critical variable. Well, this is why. It's a limitation in your ability to actually process the human face and form. You can see all facial expressions out to about 90 feet. You can see extreme expressions out to about 135 feet. And you can see biological movement somewhere between 100 and 200 feet or so. The average is 150, but it's got a standard deviation of about 50. So, 95% of people can see biological movement at 50 feet. 95% of people can't see it at 250 feet. And when you're driving down the corridor, or just when you're looking around, you really only see about 20 degrees off the center. When you put all of that together, that 20 degrees and the 90 feet, you end up with about a 60-foot wide corridor. And that corridor pops up really frequently for a dozen different reasons, or at least 3 that I know of. That's one reason. When I looked at downtown areas all over the world, the oldest areas that predate the car, the arterials, the main drag in these very old circuitous little streets, are 60 feet from building face to building face. It doesn't matter where in the world it is, except Beijing, because Beijing rebuilds everything all the time. So any of the old places, if you can find an old place in Beijing, it's still 60 feet, but they've rebuilt most of it. So, you kind of have luck. We know that perceptual narrowing happens, right? So the faster you go, the less you're seeing, right? But one of the things that never came up in that study is how far ahead are you looking at each speed? So if you're going at 18 miles an hour, you're looking right in front of you. If you're going at 50 or 60 miles an hour, you're looking pretty far down the road. When you put that distance of where you're looking on that diagram, turns out it didn't matter how fast you're going, you're still looking at 60 feet. Same 60 feet. Now, I don't know why, but it matters. You go to Portland. Portland's a relatively new city. Still predates the car. Building face to building face, 60 feet. There's also some speed limitations. So if you're going too fast, it takes time to process these faces in biological movement and find them in the environment, right? If you're going too fast, you may not be able to see that, and traffic makes that a lot worse. See these red dots? Those are people. Now, I'll tell you, when we created this video, we took that blob is the perceptual narrowing you saw on the last slide. We did an entire video of these, about 30 minutes long. When we created the video, it was about the 4th or 5th time that we were driving down this corridor before we saw those people. So if you're dealing with a corridor that wide and you're going that fast and there's things in the way, you're just not going to see the people in the corridor. So there's 3 factors that go into seeing people and interacting with them. One of them is people. One of them is that they can be seen. So, and that has to do with the corridor width and frequent interruptions. So the more interruptions you have, the more frequently you reorient your attention. And that means that we could actually project what the speed was in a corridor. I've actually been using this in practice. And it is so cool because I can take a speed study and the 85th percentile speed that we measure in the field, most of the time is within 3 miles an hour of what we project it to be. So I can put this formula, measure the stuff that's going on in the corridor, and I can tell you within about 3 miles an hour, unless there's something weird going on, and you know, tourists are weird. So if it's a tourist corridor, all bets are off. If there's a curve, all bets are off. But most of the time, within 3 miles an hour, that's accurate. For example, you remember that corridor we showed you earlier? We throw a 43-foot width at eye height, so that's the distance between the tree trunks. No doorways, obviously, and a half a mile block length. And it gives you 54 miles an hour is the 85th percentile speed to expect on that corridor. And sure enough, I am probably the 85th percentile driver. And that's how fast I was going. These, you see that top and bottom? You know what the difference is? The doorway density. So if I project the speed in this corridor without the doorway density, I get the speed at night. If I project it during the day, I get the speed during the day. Or if I add the doorway density into the formula, I get the speed during the day. These little dips here, that's when people are there. It's a school zone. So that people interaction, and remember, we're using doorway density as a proxy for human interaction. Those people really make a big difference in the speed in the corridor. So the design implications are that we can go ahead and do roadway design based on physics. We've been doing that for 80 years, right? But when you're dealing with a street, you're dealing with people. And so we need to approach that in a different way. And it comes down to, we've done the physics-based thing. The controlling concept for a street needs to be whether or not the driver is actually able to see real pedestrians and bicyclists in that street. Are they going to see them regularly? Are they going to see them close enough that they would actually interact with them? Once those 2 criteria are met, that they're going to see them regularly and they're going to be up close, the behavior completely shifts. And it's probably perfectly fine and safe for a vulnerable user to be in that space because they can get seen. Anything else, you probably are, it's an unrealistic expectation. And that means that we need to at least be cognizant that we have made some mistakes. And we're not going to blame anyone for those mistakes. We're just going to move forward and do things differently. So there's 2 design approaches. The first one is a brute force approach, and the second one is shaping the driver's behavior. Brute force uses the laws of physics. Shaping uses psychological principles. Brute force is almost always in the roadbed, right? Shaping takes everything into account, so the entire context is communicating. Brute force is very spot specific, so where you put that treatment, you're going to get an impact. Shaping, you get an impact along the entire length of the corridor. Brute force is also very speed specific. So you don't get elevated attention or caution, you just get a change in the speed. And frankly, they're probably paying more attention to the speed bump than they are to the pedestrian who's going to be on the side of the road. When you shape the environment, you don't just get speed, you get attention and awareness as well. Brute force has negative consequences. So if you put up a whole bunch of speed humps, every speed hump is going to cost you between 2 and 6 seconds on your emergency response. And if you've got them in a row, which you often need to have them in a row to make them effective, you've lost 2 for every one. If you've got 10 of them, you've lost 20 seconds going and another 20 seconds coming, and that could cost a person his life. Shaping has secondary benefits. There are economic development benefits. There's attention benefits. There are community benefits. All of these things are very positive impacts. So we went through, this was an FDOT project, and part of the project was to actually evaluate all of their design guidelines. And the strategy we gave them was this idea of integrated versus buffered. Don't care which one you pick. Are you going to integrate pedestrians and bikes into the corridor safely, or are you going to buffer them? You could do either one, but pick one. Because if they can't be seen, they can't be safe. If they can't be seen and aren't safe, then you need to buffer them. Okay? There's plenty of places that we could do an integrated spot, but not everywhere. And so in terms of a continuum, you go up to about 24 miles an hour, and you can do an integrated environment really nicely. And the safety profile here is pretty nice too. So if you get hit as a pedestrian at 25 miles an hour, you only have about a 25% chance of dying. Or, well, actually, of getting seriously injured. You only have about 12% chance of dying. That's not so bad. And so it's perfectly fine to integrate people into that cross section without any trouble. We're not talking a fantasy target speed. We're talking the real operational speed of that roadway, okay? Up here in the clear zone area, up above 40 miles an hour, fatality rates are at 50%, and the serious injuries are at 75%. So at that point, you put a person in that corridor, they really are not safe, okay? So clear zone all the way. And if a person drives off the side of the road and hits a tree at 45 miles an hour, they could kill themselves. So we need to be very intentional about making sure that that clear zone is maintained above 40 miles an hour. In between, you kind of have a problem. So it's too fast for a pedestrian to be safe, and it's too slow for the driver to feel comfortable. So the question is, what do you do? And we have some thoughts about that. So for an integrated space, you use a lateral offset. I don't care if it's breakaway or not. If the driver goes off the street, he's likely to hit a pedestrian, and I don't want him to go off the street, period. So I want his car to crash if he goes off the street before he hits my pedestrians. Just don't do that, okay? For high-speed interaction, that clear zone works really great. So you get everything out of the roadway. If your bicyclist lobby really adamantly wants to be on the road, fine, whatever. They're taking their own lives into their own hands, but I can't stop them. It's kind of like motorcyclists. You just let them do that. In between, what do you do? So here the question is, which direction are you going to push it? Are you going to push them up, or are you going to push them down? So if you want to optimize the speed on that corridor, if you want your signal systems to give you as high of throughput as you possibly can, then you're probably moving it up. And you need to find places to actually move your peds and bikes out of your clear zone, because you're trying to get people to go fast. If, on the other hand, you're trying to move this to a more multimodal environment, then you need to really think about what you're going to do to get the traffic flow to slow down. And the strategy is to add things between the roadway and the sidewalk. They can be breakaway. So you have all kinds of breakaway environmental features. You can put very small diameter trees. Now, small diameter trees turn into big diameter trees, so you better be shifting your speed profile over time. But having those vertical elements will actually slow the traffic flow down as well, and it makes the pedestrians more comfortable, right? They know that the driver has skin in the game. If they're going off the side of the road, at least they're going to scratch their paint, right? So there's good motivation for the driver not to go into the sidewalk. And the people on the sidewalk know it's going to be relatively safe. That's called a border area strategy. So everything's breakaway, but you put things as close to the roadway as you can tolerate. And then there's micro integrations. And a micro integration are the conflict zones in a buffered roadway. So you have this roadway, you've buffered all of your pedestrians out of the roadway, your bikes are not there anymore, but you're still going to have them cross the road somewhere, right? I mean, they do that. So you get very intentional about that and make sure that it is neon clear, obvious. RRFBs, PHBs, raised crosswalks, block off the median so they can only cross in that one space, because I don't want the drivers to expect them anywhere else. They're not going to. I want them to be safe. And bonus for artwork. Okay, turns out as much as FHWA has hated artwork on the roadway, it makes a big safety difference. So you lose an awful lot of crashes, particularly vulnerable user crashes, when you start painting the roadway. You don't want to do that everywhere. You only want to do that where you're going to have people there, because it becomes the cue that you're going to have people there. The driver sees that as something novel or different and knows that they need to pay attention because something different is going to happen there. So when we took this back to FDOT, their response was, that's gonna be pricey. And they're right. It's a very expensive proposition to retrofit some of the mistakes, and I will call them mistakes, that we have made that have cost people their lives. So, extreme claims require extreme proof. We're in the process right now of doing a study that will compare complete streets projects that have been completed over the last decade and see what they look like before they did the project and what they look like afterwards. Was this an improvement? Did we go backwards? Is this actually doing what we expect it to do? Is it doing nothing? Is it actually causing problems? We need to know that. And so we're doing a very detailed study of that right now. And in January, for those of you who are going to be joining me at TRB, because TRB, right? We're actually doing a workshop through ACH 40, which is the Human Factors of Infrastructure, to talk about whether or not it's time to actually pull urban design, these low-speed, multimodal environments, out of the standard Green Book criteria and give it its own philosophy, really. Think about urban design as a completely separate practice from normal roadway design. At first, when I started seeing urban design, it looked like everything was upside down and backwards. But that's only because I'm used to designing for roadways, right? Turns out it's the roadways that are upside down and backwards. We're trying to get a driver comfortable in a space they're not designed to be in. We're not designed to go that fast. We're not designed to see that far. We're not designed to process things that quickly. And so we've had to make everything huge. We've had to make all of our roadways really wide. We've had to make all of our signs really large. And everything has to be split-second reactions, because we're expecting our bodies to do things they're not designed to do. In a walkable urban environment, that's a different matter. You're made for that. Your body was designed to do that. You may not have remembered how to do that because you haven't done it lately, but everything gets so much easier, and you can use an awful lot more flexibility in that environment because your body's already made to handle that. And so we're going to be trying to talk them into thinking about that differently. And at that, I even have 8 minutes left. I'm so proud of myself. Are there any questions? Did we have any interesting questions in the chat? Any thoughts? We have a microphone.
For those of you online, if you have any question or comments, you can just unmute yourself and then raise a question.
Yeah, go ahead and unmute yourself if you've got questions. Anybody? Did I just blow your mind so much there's nobody to talk about?
Thank you for the presentation. I guess my question is, who do you consider as a vulnerable person exactly? If
Okay.
we can
Okay,
get the
so
definition.
let's be explicit about that. So vulnerable users are people like pedestrians, bicyclists. Usually, many times we include people like the disabled who have either perceptual or physical limitations, scooters, e-bikes, Vespas are kind of on the border because, you know, they're taking their lives into their own hands willingly. So are they vulnerable? Yes, they are absolutely vulnerable. But they're in the roadway. So usually it's the users that are on the side of the roadway that would interact with a vehicle and be in danger in that interaction. That make sense?
Yeah, that did. Thank you. How about, do you consider passengers vulnerable, like not the ones that are driving, but like?
No, not really, because remember they have a huge metal cage around them. And we have worked very hard to make that huge metal cage as safe as humanly possible. You can run it into a concrete wall and probably survive. So at that point, they're not particularly vulnerable.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hello.
Yeah, I think someone, I cannot see that very clearly, but someone online and raise their hand. If you have a question, you can just
Mute yourself. We can.
yeah, just unmute yourself.
Yes, can you hear me? Hello.
I can.
Hi. Thank you so much for giving this presentation. It alleviated a lot of concern that I had with roadways and urban development. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned something about how the roadway system is backwards in terms of urban development. What do you see kind of roadway transportation get improved in the next 5 to 10 years, especially in Tampa and Orlando area, since you're located there?
Well, Tampa and Orlando are both very aggressively working towards integrating peds and bikes into the roadway. Nationally, there's a huge push right now that is headed towards where Florida has headed. And the next Green Book that's coming out, it's called Green Book 8. And the roadmap that they're using right now is the same roadmap we're using for roadway design here in Florida. So rather than clustering things into arterials and collectors and local streets, they're going to be clustering things into context classifications. So, you know, an urban context classification versus, you know, the urban core versus the urban edge versus an urban general. And then there's two different types of suburban commercial and suburban residential. And then it goes all the way out into rural and then natural. So those are the 6 context classifications. The feds are working on picking that up and actually designing that into the new Green Book. My concern, and you know, this is my personal concern, not FDOT. My concern is that that adds a level of complexity that doesn't, it sheds a lot of heat, but not a lot of light. It doesn't actually make the problem really clear. And so the strategy that I have come up with in terms of, you know, we put that down. The strategy that I've been using in terms of thinking about it, in terms of blocks of speed, you know, that 0 to 24, 25 to 40, and then 40 plus, makes that really very simple, because there will be details that will matter depending on which context you're in. That's true, but you're all thinking about the same concepts when you're at that 0 to 24. When you're at 24 to 40, you're thinking about something completely different. When you're above 40 miles an hour, your whole strategy has to be completely different. So at a strategic level, if you break it out in terms of the actual operating speed, it makes a lot of this much less complicated. And engineers do tend to like to go by the book. They are awesome at that. So if you give them rules that everybody's comfortable following, they will follow them. If you try to get them to think for themselves, having worked as a practicing engineer in an office, there may not be time for a lot of engineers to actually do that. A lot of time, you've got a lot of time pressure. You need to make a decision very quickly, and your liability risk is very high. And so making a decision that's not supported by the standards in front of you is going to cost you time and money. Most of the time, they just won't. So, if we can build that flexibility in from a philosophical standpoint, because we're looking at it from a speed approach, we miss out on some of that crazy complexity that's going to make things very, very crazy making for the people who actually have to design roadways on a day-to-day basis. And the people who need the flexibility will have it, and the people who don't want it won't have to live with it. Does that make sense?
How does that tie in with suburban and urban communities, specifically around high density areas, from going into the 0 to 24, 24 to 40, and then 40 plus ranges?
Well, you think about these dense communities, the dense urban environments, even in the most dense environment, you're still going to have a mix of roadways. Now, most of them are going to be in that 0 to 24, but you're still going to have limited access freeways that go over top. You're still going to have a few arterials that feed into the community. So having those things in terms of speed buckets rather than in terms of context classifications means that you can be flexible even though you're in an urban context and you really need to be thinking about some of the details that way. Your overall philosophy can still fit with what you want that target speed to be.
Okay.
That make sense?
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. And my last question is, where do you think university students and people who are interested in being involved with urban development should look towards in terms of public safety for roads and like urban safety for like citizens and pedestrians?
As a student, you have about 30 or 40 years of practice in front of you. And when you get into practice, they're going to tell you how they're doing it now. Okay? So while you are a student, you have the opportunity and the flexibility to begin looking at alternatives. You won't have the power once you get into work to actually use any of them. I'm warning you that up front. You're going to do what you're told for the first 10 years. It's just the way it is. Live with it. But having said that, things like the Crow Manual that's used in the Netherlands, there's a book called Copenhagenize that describes how Copenhagen deals with bike and ped environments. Thinking bigger, thinking 90% of our transportation issues are not really in the roadway. 90% of those issues are in the land use. So
Sure.
if you can get land use mix at a scale that's bikeable, so if you can get your house close to your grocery store, close enough that you could actually bike to it, you got a fighting chance of actually getting people biking to it when the roadway gets so congested you can't drive on it anymore, which will happen. I mean, it's almost a guarantee. The roads get really ugly. If they're close enough, you can bike to it. So start thinking about it in terms of land use. So if you're working for a developer, talking to the developer about, hey, how about we figure out a way to move our commercial up a little earlier? Can we phase that so that we can get a little piece of that can grow? The Incremental Development Alliance is a great resource for that. They are really good at dealing with infill. They'll tell you how to develop a real piece of property yourself. It will not make you rich quick. It will make you wealthy. And it doesn't actually take an awful lot of money to get started. You just need a little bit of expertise, and they can provide that. So those are good places to start. NACTO, obviously, here in the US has an awful lot of guidance for designing urban spaces. they're a very balanced place to start, at least for the US. The reason why I suggest places like the Netherlands and Copenhagen is because they've taken this to the ultimate extent. They know what the end point looks like, and we don't. So it's a good place to actually start looking because they have an idea of where the path is going to head. Will we end up where they are? I don't know. We have a hard time with it because their density is really high and ours is not. And ours may never be. So it's at least a good place to start picking up details. And I think that is all we have time for.
Yeah, maybe
you
we
very
can take
much.
one more question or comment. Well, if there's no question or comment from the audience, and Dr. Tice, thank you for your really intriguing presentation. I have one question or like a comment, like
In a lot of ways, that's a huge unknown. Part of the problem is the adoption time frame. So vehicles only turn over maybe 20 or 30% a year. So you lose 20 or 30% of the existing fleet every year that gets replaced, right? CAVs are extraordinarily expensive. I mean, a new car at this point is running $50,000. A lot of money. And a lot of people are not going to want or need, they may need, but they won't want to spend that much money because they just don't have it. And so, there's been a lot of talk about driving becoming a shared thing. I have my doubts on that. I just don't know how that's going to work. From a design standpoint, I've seen some really interesting things. Unfortunately, you need to get to 20 to 30% absorption before you can begin to do different things in terms of both operations and design. So as long as you have less than 30% of the vehicle fleet is automated, you basically have to treat it like there's none. When you get to about 30%, you can begin to do a little tweak here and there. Things like I've seen designs where the lane width goes down to 7 feet wide. If you're not driving it and that car can really clearly see that lane width, a 7 foot wide lane is no big deal because the car can do that. You can't, but that car can. And at that point, we've got a little more space to work with that maybe we can give back to the peds and bikes. One of the things that I've been pushing from a driver behavior standpoint, one of the things I've been pushing people to think about in the CAV industry is this idea that our own brains prioritize human presence over everything else. If we see people, that comes to the very top of your thinking. And there's very few things that are more important to your mind than seeing another human being. What does that say about the priority that pedestrian and bicycling detection needs to have in a CAV? Now, to me, that says that probably needs to have the same level of priority, that they need to be just as aware, if not more aware than we are. But then we've got questions about how do you interact? And there's all kinds of studies out there. It's actually gotten really interesting about how a pedestrian could actually communicate with an automated vehicle if the driver's not paying attention. Because obviously you can make eye contact with a driver when he's driving. Making eye contact with a driver who's not driving doesn't do you any good. So, how do you know what the vehicle intends to do? How do you actually communicate that to the pedestrian? And we'll work those things out, but I don't know that we're going to work them out in my lifetime. We might. I mean, I'm 52 now and not ashamed of it. Thank you very much. So will they do that before I'm 80 in the next 30 years? It's possible. I don't know that it's real likely, but it's possible. I mean, we could see some major shifts. A lot of that's going to happen. We've got problems with batteries. We've got problems with the AI itself, the bandwidth, the actual transmission pipes for transferring all this information, the storage for all of this information. that doesn't mean we can't fix those things. I would be much more copacetic with the electric vehicle industry if we were dealing with a sodium battery than a lithium battery, but we're not. And these are, there's issues with power generation. Where are we going to get all the power to run all these vehicles? We've already, you have 1 week that California says we're only going to sell electric vehicles as of 2030, and the very next week they have a brownout throughout the entire state. There's a disconnect here. There's a certain amount of reality that's not getting through. So, we have big issues to deal with. Is it going to go away? No, it shouldn't. I mean, over the long haul, we will have to go that direction. I don't know that we go that fast. Does that make sense? It's gonna get exciting.
Our time, and again, I think I'm going to end here. And Dr. Tice,
Thank you
very much for the presentation.
Thank you for the opportunity.
And for those of you who are guest attendees to this seminar, and just let you know that this seminar is sponsored by Qatar and the CE department and USF IT student chapter and the 3 UTC centers like CTAC, NICER, and the TOMIT, and also the Women in Transportation Seminars, WTS. So,
well, and this research is largely sponsored by FDOT Central Office.
Yeah, appreciate that support. And for your information, there will be no seminar next Friday, so because of holiday, and we will have one last seminar in this semester in 2 weeks. So hopefully you can join.
Enjoy your holiday.
Thank you very much.
Take care.